Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Robert Klitzman. I'm a professor of psychiatry, and I'm the director of the Masters of Bioethics program here at Columbia University. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this event, which our program in bioethics is delighted to be co-sponsoring with the Columbia School of Nursing. Several months ago, we held a webinar on moral distress, nursing, and bioethics, challenges and solutions. And the events and panelists there vividly describe the immense moral strains and ethical dilemmas that nurses have been increasingly facing, exacerbated, unfortunately, by the COVID pandemic over the past 2+ years. We decided then to organize this evening's event as a follow-up to focus on promising approaches to moral distress among nurses, to explore possible solutions, to focus on possible solutions to the challenges we described then. Macro level changes, including more funding for nurses, is clearly crucial at nationwide levels. But given the current state of the economy and other strains in the healthcare system, some of that may not realistically happen in the immediate future. In the meantime, nurses and healthcare facilities have been devising novel ways of addressing some of these strains. We have a wonderful panel this evening to talk about what has been going on and what might be doable at various levels, from macro down to micro. First, we're delighted to have Rosanne Raso. She is Vice President and Chief Nursing Officer and Editor-in-Chief of Nursing Management, New-York-Presbyterian Hospital, and also at Weill Cornell Medical Center. And Dr. Raso is a leading voice and figure in nursing and in thinking about moral strains and how to solve them among nurses. Next, we will hear from Leanne McMahon, who is Executive Vice President of Patient Care Services and Chief Nursing Officer at White Plains Hospital. After her, we'll hear from David Hoffman, who is a healthcare attorney and clinical ethicist and is the Chief Compliance Officer at a system of critical access hospitals in upstate New York. He's also a lecturer in bioethics here at Columbia. And last but by no means least, Danisha Jenkins is a nurse whose scholarship following her doctorate in nursing focuses on biopolitical power structures and institutions, including studying moral injury in the setting of COVID and the intersection of nursing and law enforcement. And she is an active participant in several professional boards in California and is at UC Irvine. I've asked each panelist to talk about how they've approached the challenges they have faced, what kinds of solutions they have been developing, what has worked well, what they did, how they did develop it, what obstacles they have faced, or what challenges still exist as they see it, and importantly, what suggestions they would have for others facing these stresses. Very importantly, I want to thank the organization committee for this event and our prior event, and the Columbia School of Nursing, and in particular, Elaine Larson, Mary Trescalo, Nessa Coyle, Karen Sobek, Cinda Rushton, and Renee McLeod-Sorgen, as well as Danisha Jenkins and David Hoffman. Two other announcements. This event is eligible for continuing nursing education credit. Please be on the lookout for instructions provided in the chat box during the event on how to apply for that credit. And we see this event this evening as a very interactive session. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat at any point, and we hopefully will be able to address all of them, or as many as we can. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Rosanne Raso. Rosanne, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, hello, everybody. And my intention in my few minutes is to give more of a macro level look at what's happening, and particularly a leadership framework on how to move forward. So the first thing I want to mention is that we must acknowledge the stress, the moral injury, and all of the things that you just heard Bob talk about. I think in some organizations, there is a tendency to push that away. Let's move forward. Let's get to our goals. And denial is just not a sustainable strategy. So it's important to acknowledge. And one thing I read about recently was called toxic positivity. I don't know if you've heard of it. And I actually started to worry if I was guilty of it. And toxic positivity is when you're all, rainbows and sunshine, and don't leave any space for acknowledging the strains, the stressors, and the moral issues that people are facing. So that's one thing. Avoid that. We're all kind of sensitive now, and it's important to keep this on the front burner. I've done some research on the past couple of years in year 1 and year 2 of the pandemic related to authentic nurse leadership, healthy work environment, well-being, and intent to leave. And there was some good news there, because in the studies, and we're talking thousands of nurses in the United States, authentic nurse leadership, which is a relational style that focuses on being true to your values, moral courage, relationships, and communication, that authentic leadership was present. The nurses perceived its presence. So that means nurse leaders are leading, even under the strain that they're under. And I think that's positive, and it's something we have to shore up and help the leaders to lead. Healthy work environment was not really present. That's not a surprise. It was slightly below where one would say that it was present. Well-being came out at risk. I actually expected it to be worse than that. So the overall score was at risk. And we all know that. And my caution about well-being for all organizations, including my own New York-Presbyterian, is that self-care and resiliency building is just not enough. And especially if it's done in a way that puts the kind of individual as the approach. Like, you have to be more resilient, and you need to have better self-care, because it is not the worker we need to fix. It's the workplace we need to fix. And I think that's where we need to focus. We've been very resilient, extremely resilient. I don't think we could be more resilient. So it's not the worker, it's the workplace. So sorry about that. The other thing that's contributing is the kind of social disintegration is complicating it a little further. So I think that organizations who have really taken a very strong stand on zero tolerance and consequences for bad behavior, whether it be patients or visitors, that's a really, really important stand for nurses to not just have a policy in a book. It has to be felt and lived, that there really is zero tolerance for that. Leadership is critical. I was just at a Burnout conference, and author of a book named Bob Chapman, who wrote about human leadership, he did a survey, and I'm not sure of the end size, but he said 65% of the respondents said they would rather have their boss fired than get a raise. Now, this is not nurses, and this is not, it wasn't healthcare, but it wasn't necessarily a nurse population. And the point he was making was that leadership matters for a person personally. It's not just about work. It's almost like a social determinant of health. When you have a boss that you don't feel trusts you, and you don't have a relationship with, that not only affects the workplace, but affects the person. So relational leadership, that is where communication is engaging, transparent, frequent, where there is caring in the leadership. There is visibility. There is actual listening. There is thank yous. So all of this, what kind of leadership we have, like for me, I am trying my darndest not to resort to any transactional leadership at all, where it's, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and you don't, and you're in trouble. That is not the kind of leadership we need right now. We need relational leadership, not transactional leadership. Another framework we could use is all the healthy work environment frameworks. There's several out there. This is another place to start. I use this. I use the American Association of Critical Care Nurses framework. You may be familiar with it. It's at least 15 years old. There's 6 standards to it. They still hold up. Staffing is one of them. Fixing staffing is definitely high on the list. You've talked to any nurse about stressors and staffing is up there. There is communication, which we've talked about. There is recognition, which we've talked about. And recognition is not just an award for one person every month. It is a culture where professional growth and mentoring and development is nurtured. Shared decision-making, having voice, letting staff fix problems, all that is part of a healthy work environment. And those healthy work environments are antidotes to burnout, moral distress, and turnover. Another framework I love is good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I just wrote an editorial about that. It comes out in another month or so. But that's another framework. Think about it. The physical needs and the psychological needs are basic, foundational on the bottom. That includes breaks. That includes having a mealtime. These are important. And then you build on that for recognition, having a voice, belonging, engagement. People don't leave when they work in an environment like that. I just got an invitation from Cone Health in North Carolina. They are doing a consortium on a framework for nurse retention. It's Maslow and Hertzberg's motivational theory put together in a nursing framework. So I thought that was pretty darn clever. And if anybody wants that information, I might be able to get it to you. So I think I might be running out of time already. I do want to mention that as part of nursing management's approach to Nurse Week, we did a Why I Stay campaign. We were trying to change the narrative from the Great Resignation to Why I Stay. Every video that came in, every comment that came in was about team and colleagues. This work is about the people, and we have to focus on them. Organizations have to make wellness a priority. There has to be a budget for it. There should be a metric on the dashboard that goes to the board along with patient experience, quality, and the finances. It really needs to be an organizational priority. I used to think, and I still think, that my job, and I used to tell all of the orientees every month that my job as chief nurse was to make sure patients got great care and that staff had a great environment to work in so they could provide great care. And those were connected and they were equal. Staff is more important to me now. If staff are not well, patients are not going to get good care, period. So we all need to be lifted up, and it's about the people. So in summary, we need relationship-based leadership. We need organizational commitment to this work. We need engagement with each other, the people. We need to address the workplace. We need to live our values, get rid of stupid stuff, let staff fix problems and make sure they have a voice. We need to lead with love. And it seems like a lot. And so my advice is pick something and do it. You don't have to do it all, but pick something and do it. It's big picture work and it's local work. So I am now going to pass on to Leanne.
Great, and thank you so much. And that was, I assure you, you're not a victim or a perpetrator of toxic positivity, but rather of heartfelt wisdom, it sounds to me. And we're getting some wonderful questions in the chat. Please keep them coming. And without further ado, Leanne, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Rosanne. I can't agree with you more. I'm going to talk a little bit of some of the things that we have worked on and which these things have really helped us through the past two and a half years. Really the worst time in healthcare that I've ever experienced, and leadership and how leadership and can work together to create a healthy work environment and really develop a culture that you can depend on. I really love the culture that we have here in White Plains Hospital and was so grateful when a crisis hit that this culture was able to rise up and help us. And so it's nurses and what we're dealing with moral distress and burnout, but it's a culture of an entire organization. that supports all of our staff, because when this crisis hit, we needed everybody, and we needed everybody to support each other. So some of the things are creating structures that really help to develop our leaders and understand the structures that are put in place that just help us to routinely incorporate those relationships and that communication with our staff. Communication, and how you create those structures that are multi-level, that are from top up, that are from bottom up, how you can create standardized messages that are important not just during a crisis, but every day. If you're trying to make changes, you're trying to advance your organization, it's helpful to help leaders to be able to communicate that standardized message so that every employee that's talking to each other is hearing the same thing. That consistency, if there's a crisis and changes are happening, make sure that those communications are consistent, and certainly acknowledge when you don't know something or things are changing, and acknowledge what you know and you don't know. And that was really key for us during the crisis, was letting the staff know we were going to communicate everything we knew. We were in this together, and we're going to get through this together. With that communication, you have to have visibility. One of the things that I do is round with the CEO, and the CEO and the CNO, we go out on the units. It's so important for the staff to see that we are seeing what they're going through, and we understand, and give them an opportunity to talk to us. But it's also the daily huddles that are ingrained into that culture that you can depend on day to day, whether it's a leadership daily huddle and understanding what's going on and communicating that message, or unit-based, helping the managers to develop communications. And I think, Rosanne mentioned relationships. We're making sure that managers set time apart to round on their staff. And rounding on their staff, getting to know their staff, building those relationships really help to identify if somebody's struggling very quickly, and let's find out why they're struggling, and let's get that person their help. The second big piece of this is shared decision-making structures, and Rosanne talked about this. I cannot talk about how grateful I was to our shared decision-making structures during this entire COVID pandemic, but I'm so grateful to them every single day. We have a robust shared decision-making structure that has a lot of autonomy and are empowered to have a voice. We were all doing our own thing to get through COVID, and our shared decision-making structures are so empowered. Our professional practice council and our nurse experience council stepped up and took charge of what they could take charge. Our nurse experience council wanted to make sure they were supporting nurses and that nurses had a voice, and immediately started to send out emails. And they included humor, what was happening, changes. They reiterated who could they talk to if they needed help. They were such a valuable resource to all of us in the leadership team and to the frontline nurses. One of the things that they did early on, they knew nurses were really struggling, and they asked if they could do a survey. I said yes. I really wasn't paying attention to the survey. I read it quickly. It was really open-ended questions. They got the information back and wanted to do something for the staff with the results. And because it wasn't scientific, and they had a lot of good intent in sending this out, but we weren't sure what to do with these results. So I sat down and I read all 200 results, and the comments were really, they were astounding. And my conclusion had come very quickly, that there was so much resilience baked into what they were saying and how they had gotten through this. The council decided to do resilience cafes, in which we spoke about how powerful they were, and recognize what they had gone through, but how much stronger they were and how important they were. And we did resilience cafes where over 400 or 500 nurses, I have 650 nurses, came to these 2-hour sessions. They followed that. We did that in November of 2020. And through the success of that, they had asked me to come back and do burnout sessions, which we finished in April. And just to constantly, Rosanne talked about, we've got to acknowledge it. We can't ignore it, acknowledge what they went through. But really, we wanted to acknowledge how powerful they were in battling this crisis, and that should never be forgotten, what they had accomplished. And so I think having a shared decision-making structure that gives a voice to nurses at all levels and has that ability to create those communication structures up and down really are key to building those healthy work environments and identifying issues quickly on and getting the leadership team together to figure out what it is that we can do to help nurses. Developing nurses that can bring up the issues themselves, develop the solutions themselves, have really helped us as an organization to get through this, and really continuing to talk about the message that we're stronger today, we're better today, and how do we continue to stay strong and stay well, and what's that next thing that we have to do. And that what they have gone through will stay with them forever, but it should stay with them as a strength and to continue to advance the profession of nursing. And that's all I have.
Great. Well, again, wise words. So thank you. And we're getting wonderful questions and comments in the chat. So please keep them coming, and we should be able to get to those soon. But first, we have David Hoffman. David, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Everything that's been said, and I have to tell you, over the 36 years that I've been practicing in hospitals in a variety of different roles, I've seen just a remarkable change in the stature and standing of nurses, and especially as a result of COVID and all we've been through. And I would say, from a moral distress perspective, the silver lining to COVID is that senior management, the CEO and the CFO, understand how important and how dependent we are on the nursing staff to be able to do anything, and to an extent that I haven't seen in prior years. So I advise hospitals currently from coast to coast. So I've seen the way nurses interact with medical staff members, other clinicians, executive leadership, and I'm seeing some real encouraging signs. And one of them was actually yesterday. So I got a phone call from the nurse manager at the ER of a hospital that I advise, and she was very concerned. She had a adolescent mental health patient in the emergency department, and the physician up on the floor who was called to admit the patient said the patient doesn't meet admission criteria. The patient should be referred out. And the nurse manager said to the physician, well, there's nowhere that the patient will be accepted for a whole variety of clinical reasons. Would you please take the patient up to the floor just for now, until we can find somewhere more appropriate than boarding in the emergency department? And in a slightly passive aggressive way, the physician said, no, not going to accept the patient. Patient doesn't meet criteria. And she picked up the phone and she called me. And that's not unusual for me. It is probably rather unusual for most hospital counsel to receive a phone call like that from a nurse manager. But I make myself available, and I urge my lawyer colleagues to make themselves available, specifically so that nurses, and especially nurse managers, feel like they have someone to turn to in the moment. And it's that in the moment notion that is the best solution that we can offer to nurses to deal with their distress when they know what is the right thing to do for a patient and they're not able to bring that about. But the reason I'm telling this story is the phone call that followed, which was from the administrator over that whole inpatient area. And he said, so I don't understand. We have a dispute between a nurse manager and a physician, and I get a phone call from the hospital's lawyer. I don't understand why. And instead of accepting that question as sarcasm, which is probably how it was intended, I took it as a sincere question. And I said, great question. Let me answer it. And I explained to him that in my compliance role, used to be that compliance was really dealing just with money. And several years ago, the policy in New York and around the country that defines what are the responsibilities of a compliance program added, in addition to fraud and abuse and billing and coding and governance, they added quality and medical necessity. And I said to him, since I know, both from my professional experience as a lawyer and compliance officer and from my years working as an EMT, I know that boarding a patient with mental health needs in the emergency department is not good quality care. And sure, if there were somewhere more appropriate that we could transfer the patient, we would do that. But right now, we as an institution need to support this nurse manager who's making her judgment that the emergency department is not the right place for that patient. And let me acknowledge, because I don't want to be Pollyannic, that the administrator wasn't especially happy with this message, but he accepted it. Why? Because he has to. Because we are at a point in hospital administration where nurses have a place to turn, whether it's counsel or a compliance officer, or, as I discussed in my new employee training sessions, if nothing else works, calling the compliance hotline and leaving an anonymous message. And those messages get logged and they get reported. They get reported all the way up to the board, to the governing body. So that matters, and it has a real impact. And this notion represents just an enormous amount of progress. I know this because as we were preparing for the program tonight, I was reflecting on when it was worse. And in the early 2005, 2006 range, the Joint Commission came up with a new set of obligations. They do that often. Their obligation to chart condition, indication, or diagnosis with every medication order. And there were a range of reasons for that. We don't have to get into that now. But the nursing staff said, well, this is a new requirement. If the CID, condition, indication, or diagnosis is not charted, our position is we should not fill the order. And the physician staff said, well, no, that would be withholding necessary care. You have to fill the order, and we'll deal with why the condition, indication, or diagnosis wasn't charted later. And they said, well, if we take that approach, this problem will never get solved. And I listened to this back and forth for, 15, 20 minutes, trying my best to stay in the background where I mostly belong. And I said, well, why can't we do this right the first time? And I got lots of dirty looks from the representatives from the physician medical staff because I was backing up the nurses. And I said, if an order has been entered, this was in the days of paper medical records, if an order has been entered and there isn't a condition, indication, or diagnosis, somebody ought to be able to call the person who wrote the order and just get them to come back and correct the order. And the physician said, well, yeah, but what if you can't reach the person? You're withholding medication that is needed immediately, or it wouldn't have been ordered. And I said, absolutely true. So if the person who wrote the order doesn't answer within 5 minutes, there should be an escalation. It should go to the chief resident, then it should go to the attending, and then it should go to the medical director. And if none of those people are able to solve the problem, I will commit to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Call me. I'll find the person who didn't chart the condition, indication, or diagnosis and get that done. And everyone was horrified at the notion that someone farther up in senior management would be notified about something as minor as not charting the indication for a medication order. And let me tell you, the number of calls I got because no one came down to enter their condition, indication, and diagnosis was zero. And that tells me that if senior executive management steps up and says, we're going to monitor this in real time, and I'm the end of the chain, that's a solution that empowers nurses, and we can do more of that. And that's why I'm hopeful. Bob, back to you.
Great. Well, again, thank you, David. Great insights and a different perspective, given your role as a lawyer, et cetera. And last but not least, we have Danisha. Danisha, welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much. So the promising approaches I discussed today are really gleaned from my experiences caring for COVID-19 patients, my role as a director of critical care and emergency services, and also guided by a mixed methods longitudinal study I've been co-investigating with 2 trauma experts at the University of California, Irvine. I'm a recently resigned critical care nurse, a nurse ethicist, a nursing director, and I serve on the ethics advisory board for ANA's Center for Ethics and Human Rights. And I want to begin my spiel here by acknowledging that talking about anything else other than the continued gutting of human rights and environmental protections feels awkward and out of place today. And I remind myself that these topics are not disjointed, and now more than ever, we must discuss promising solutions to prepare for, to mitigate, and to respond to nurses working at the consequence end of violent legislation that is operationalized within these violent systems. So as we discuss solutions to moral distress, it's really important that we look at the research for a better understanding of root causes. And Hamrick et al. Has provided us with a theoretical framework that has shown that moral distress for healthcare workers is generally manifested from these 3 buckets. We have clinical situations like providing futile care and conflicting clinical duties. We have internal constraints like perceptions of powerlessness and self-doubt. And then we have external constraints like intraprofessional conflict, inadequate staffing, lack of administrative support, and compromised care due to productivity and profit motives. And the literature also tells us that this distress occurs in high stakes, usually life or death situations, with constraining environments that have these staunch power hierarchies, and when we have to make decisions that are linked to survival. And for those of us working as nurses, particularly in critical care environments, these descriptions sound hauntingly familiar and have certainly been brought to extremes throughout the course of the pandemic. And these responses to moral injury are often extreme emotional responses that are quite congruent with trauma, up to and including substance dependence, self-harm, and suicide. So in my study, we studied a multitude of variables, but to be succinct, the results showed that only organizational support and institutional betrayal were unique predictors of moral distress. This was blaringly evident in the qualitative data as well, and the data demonstrated that this strict focus on individual factors may not address the challenges of our profession. And this is important, like Rosanne said, because much of the intervention we see across the country and continue to see is very individual driven. Interventions like meditation, yoga, self-care, lavender. And that's not to say that those practices don't have value in certain circumstances. However, if our goal as leaders is truly to address moral injury and distress and to enhance the mental health and well-being of nurses, then those interventions just aren't sufficient. So I'm a firm believer that as adult humans, if we ask nurses what is needed, they will tell us. And nurses have been saying for decades that we need staffing. And this makes a lot of sense, given Hamrick's model of moral distress, because not having the necessary resources to safely care for your patients is either directly causative or exacerbates other contributors to moral distress. And for some reason, staffing has been and continues to be one promising approach to preventing moral distress that many hospitals refuse to get behind. Now, it's not uncommon to hear about the tremendous cost of the labor workforce and phrases like nursing is a non-revenue generating cost. However, I remind us all that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us more than ever that there is no revenue to be generated without nurses. And our study demonstrates this critical importance of leaders and administrators understanding that the nursing workforce perceives and has experienced tremendously damaging ramifications of profit and productivity motives that supersede the provision of necessary resources in order to adequately provide care. And this was described countless times in our study using the word betrayal. This perception needs to be addressed in order to begin to build a bridge of trust. Nurses also report feeling dehumanized using words like sacrificial lamb and cannon fodder. And so we have to take seriously what it feels like to work in these systems and these circumstances. Nurses not only need to be kept safe, they need to trust and believe that they are being kept safe. And this is only going to come with drastic changes to how healthcare systems and leaders listen to their nurses and also what they are doing with what they hear. So we know that suicidality in nurses is twice that of the general population. So we have to look to promising approaches that put a focus on preventing moral distress as much as possible. And much of that burden does fall on the organizations and leadership themselves. Healthcare institutions do not want legislation or regulation dictating how our hospitals are staffed, but we are seeing increasingly that health institutions all around the country are not responding to the voice of nurses, nor the evidence that supports much more robust staffing levels, nor the patient harm and death that is occurring secondary to missed care. So time and time again, nurses have told stories of the straws that broke their backs, stories of having too many patients that they can reasonably care for, like walking into their patient's room to find that they had self-extubated and died alone, or patients falling, or bags of pressors running dry. The examples of this missed care that too often result in irreparable harm and even death are endless. And so addressing these realities directly related to insufficient staffing and this attribution to organizational betrayal offers a promising approach to prevent moral distress from happening in the first place. Now, we need to talk about promising approaches to address the damage that has already been done. And while leaders work to mitigate these dangers and violence that we know is inherent to caring practices within a capitalist healthcare system, we have to understand that an important first step is to move beyond that burnout, resilience, and self-care rhetoric. People do not end their lives simply because they're burnt out and didn't do enough self-care. People do not walk out on the career that they love because they're not resilient enough. So many nurses are in mental health crisis because of the organizational betrayal they experienced while trying to keep our hospitals afloat and keep their patients alive. Nurses need access to support to obtain psychiatric and psychological care to receive the mental health treatment that they need. Different hospital systems have begun to operationalize this in different ways, but I want to emphasize that this goes beyond third-party EAP programs. We need paid leaves of absence and organizationally funded mental health services. This is critical for the success in this intervention. Also, nurses need safe spaces without fear of retaliation or reporting to boards of registered nursing to be honest about challenges with substance dependence. We must have spaces where nurses can safely come forward without risk of retaliation to disclose their struggles and get the support they need to obtain treatment. We have seen tremendous success with such a program, and several nurses from just one unit have come forward to say that they were on the brink of taking their own life, and that the support and funded access to intensive psychiatric care saved them. We have supported biweekly forums with a psychiatrist and psychologist for therapeutic group intervention. The nurses are paid their normal hourly rate of pay to attend, and we have consistently sustained 30 to 50 participants for a year, and this is just from 2 units. From this venue, over a dozen nurses have sought intensive mental health services, and the best news is that they are alive, they have come back to work, and they have begun to find a renewed sense of meaning in the work that they do. Additionally, and so exciting to me, is these nurses have acted as a tremendous support system for their colleagues because they're now experts in this process of recovery. So ultimately, robust and paid psychological services are an essential intervention, and it tells the nurses that they are valued and recognizes the severity of their experience. So, COVID surges are continuing, and with the recent stripping of human rights in the Supreme Court and the countless pieces of legislation that have come forward throughout the country requiring nurses to withhold care and act as an arm of law enforcement, we can absolutely forecast that morally distressing events are going to continue to challenge the nursing profession. And we have to reckon with the ways that the nursing profession itself potentiates and upholds these harms against ourselves and against others. And concurrently, there is a tremendous value in supplying sufficient staffing resources, that's a start, and organizational support and guidance for nurses as we navigate caring for our communities during this time.
Research and work you're doing. Thank you. So we've been getting some wonderful questions, and again, please feel free to ask questions. Those of you who are listening, here are two questions that came in that seem related. One is, how do staff nurses communicate that organizational leadership is not actually listening to staff when the leaders see their culture as collaborative already? And relatedly, someone who I'd like to boost the questions of those who suggest that perceptions of staff empowerment and responsibility are widely different coming from leadership versus staff. So what do you do if leaders, you all are wonderful leaders, but not all of us are lucky to work at institutions with such leaders. What do we do? Any thoughts?
I mean, I could take a first crack at it. I think the concept of listening is interesting because I think sometimes we think the other person hasn't heard us if they don't do what we say. Therefore, they haven't listened. So there could be a problem with listening, or there could be a problem with not closing the loop on the communication. Like, I heard what you said and I tried to make it happen, but I couldn't because of A, B, and C. Let's think about another way we could approach this, whatever, some kind of closed loop. So I think the concept of listening sometimes needs to be explored more. Now, if you really feel unheard, you have to talk to your leaders. There needs to be forums for that, whether it's one-on-one or groups. And I think working with nurse leaders and working with HR leaders helps. I think I have many, many ways that I communicate. One includes what I call my staff advisory board. And those are the staff nurses that lead the campus level councils in the shared governance. And boy, I tell you, I can keep my finger on the pulse of things from that group. And I have take homes from that. And I make sure at the next meeting that I close the loop on that. The other related question was, like, staff don't really feel empowered, but the organization thinks they've empowered me. And I am beginning to not like the word empowerment sometimes because it does get misused. So if you get delegated something, it's like, I'm empowering you to do this, but it's really just a pure, delegation. It doesn't make you any more powerful or have more of a voice. So those are just some initial thoughts. Maybe somebody else has some thoughts.
I'll take
Other
a crack.
panelists?
Yes, I'll talk a little bit. I think, I put a lot of stake on our shared decision-making structures, and it takes a long, long time to create the right culture in which there is honest communication and trust. And believe me, we've gone through different evolutions and iterations. It really does take a long time. And there's a lot that has to go into understanding what empowerment means and what are you empowered to do. We're creating cultures and structures to make a stronger organization that can provide better care to our patients and safer environments for us to work in. And if that's our goal, you're empowered to help us to come up with solutions to reach those goals. And you're accountable to be in the game and creating those solutions. And so once you kind of get to that point where we're all rowing in the same direction and listening, and there has to be one of the first things I learned is when you create a shared decision-making structure and you're working on these same goals and staff are coming to you, there's always some low-hanging fruit. They see things differently. And I always call them those insanity moments of like, oh my gosh, why have we been doing that? And you've got to be able to make those changes. And that is what grows that empowerment. You have to work very, very hard on developing relationships and where staff feel comfortable coming to either their leader, or if they're not getting the answers, going to their next leader, their director. One of the things in that survey that I talked about, there were just such powerful buckets that fell into resilience and what helped them to get through that crisis. And it was over and over again, it was their colleagues and their leaders, and by name, and what they did specifically, those leaders, to be able to support them through this crisis. And that has to be an everyday kind of leader that she just went into overdrive and recognized from her relationships with her staff and other staff. Nurses coming out of the OR that have not been on the front line for years are now part of her staff, and how do I support that staff? They were able to recognize and identify people we needed to pull out quickly because they were out there communicating, listening, and identifying. And staff were coming to leaders and saying, listen, you got to help this person. They're trying, and just get involved. And so it really is what becomes a culture. And it takes a lot of work.
I couldn't agree more. And I would say everyone in executive leadership in hospitals thinks and says that they are advocates for nurses. They need to be called out on that question. So it's a carrot and a stick. It's inviting them to step off the sideline and actually get involved at the patient care level in solving and mediating disputes between nursing and physicians, and also getting them to commit to spending time just talking to nurses. The more people within the leadership of a hospital organization that are actually talking to nurses on a day-to-day basis about patient care issues, the better off it is for everyone, and the better is the quality of the care provided.
Great. Danisha, any comments on that?
Yeah, and I think my comment also applies to another question that was brought up about managers having too many direct reports. I think some of the disconnect can come in the inability of direct managers to actually have authentic connections with their staff. And in these moments of crises, as a leader, you're asking your team to do things that are very scary, and you're not providing them a lot of information. You're asking them to trust you in some circumstances is their life or their license. And if you don't have those authentic relationships with your team members, they really don't have a great reason to trust you. And it's really, really hard to have those relationships when, as a manager, you have 70 upwards of 300 direct reports that you're responsible for. So this is another opportunity for executive level leadership to invest in those frontline direct managers and making sure that they have the resources in order to take care of their team members. Several of the speakers today talked about the importance of that authentic, engaged leadership, and we need to make it possible for our leaders to be able to perform in that way.
Great comments. Thank you all. So I'm going to come back to the case of the nurse calling up David. So a few of you mentioned getting leaders involved. So a nurse is struggling. Should the nurse call the hospital lawyer, or what should they do when they feel, quote, leadership isn't listening? What practically, any suggestions? Is that okay? Should there be some limits on that?
Well, I don't like to set limits on anybody, honestly, although I do prefer the chain of command being used and not being surprised. But if somebody is frustrated and goes that way, or calls the compliance hotline, sometimes things happen that way. I want staff to know that they can call whoever they feel they need to call in the moment. We use a lot of HR contacts when there's issues, and HR, it really helps us to resolve. Usually the lawyer is called by a leader, not necessarily by a staff nurse, but I'm not into power, so I'm fine with it.
And to be fair, the nurse did go through her chain of command first.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it got to the point where the physician came down to see the patient. And that is always the best solution. I like to say in compliance training that if you have a problem, the best person to bring it to is your supervisor, unless your supervisor is the problem.
Right.
I'll add, I would be very sad. I would never tell someone not to contact anyone if there was an issue, but I would be very sad if our environment did not support our nurses, and that somewhere along the line there was someone to help that person. I will say I have a tremendous partner with our chief medical officer, and physicians come to me regularly. Nurses will just email Dr. Palumbo. Nurses, emailing anyone in the organization, whether it's HR, I do agree, is another support. I try to get our HR partners out on the floors, making relationships and rounding also, so that staff know that there's somebody in the organization that's going to help you to resolve that issue.
I do love your phrase authentic relationship, because that really is what matters.
So here's a question. Do you think nurses are paid slave level wages by the multi-trillion-dollar hospital plantation industry? How can nurses get higher compensation? Thoughts on the issue of compensation, or that question?
So I would say the issue of compensation is a very important issue to discuss, but I also want to remind ourselves that to compare concerns related to wage with chattel slavery in the United States of America is not appropriate. And the struggles of Black Americans secondary to the conditions that they were under is not something that is necessary in this conversation. That being said, compensation issues are of critical importance, and we do know that there are tremendous disparities in pay across the nursing profession, both based on race and on gender. So it is something critical for organizations to understand that pay needs to be addressed. And because we live in a capitalist system and our healthcare system is capitalist, we saw the ramifications of not staying ahead of the curve related to wages for registered nurses and what happened with the travel nurse industry. So there were times of self-correction in which some nurses were able to take advantage of the opportunity to be paid more fairly for the work that was being done across the system. So there is going to be backlash if we fall behind on wages, especially when many hospital systems aren't even keeping up with the current rate of inflation. Wages are a critical way of how we in this society tell someone that they are valuable. So it is a significant issue.
Great. Here's a question of Frank Hicks, Masters of Divinity. Hospital chaplain, how can we, I guess he is a hospital chaplain, how can we come alongside nurses to assist with moral injury? Any thoughts about hospital?
I'll take this one. I saw this question. Our hospital chaplain has had a significant role helping us to battle our moral distress. Right before COVID, our hospital chaplain approached me and asked if they could introduce care codes, which was going out and helping to care for staff every day. And they wanted to put this in place with a social worker that they were working with. And lo and behold, COVID came and they stepped into gear. Again, I'll go back to the survey, and something I hear all the time was Rabbi Freda and her care code team, how much they mean to our frontline staff. And she's just always there. A staff nurse, a leader, anyone in the organization can just give her a call, put an email, and she will come to the unit, and she brings little treats, and they bring the holistic nurses with them, and aromatherapy, anything that they ask for, they come and spend 5 minutes. I've been invited and been on the units. It's a wonderful 5 minutes that the staff appreciate so much. And we appreciate Rabbi Freda and her team so much. They are mentioned constantly.
At
Yes.
my hospital at New York-Presbyterian, I'm specifically talking about Weill Cornell, the chaplains are really embedded in the teams on the units. And that makes a huge difference, kind of being embedded in teams to the point of even going on rounds in some of the ICUs, things like that. Also, our chaplain, the head of the chaplains, is on our tiered huddle every morning, knows what's going on, knows where the trouble spots are, and will be visible. Also helps organize Schwartz rounds for various important issues affecting everybody's moral integrity. And there was a couple of questions about withdrawal and dealing with that moral distress, which is huge. And the chaplains being involved in the case in debriefing and in supporting staff is one really impactful thing that chaplains can help with. And since I'm on withdrawals, I'll just kind of also mention that in our, and I'm going to call out our surgical ICU, this issue was big for nurses in terms of the end-of-life care. And they worked with their attendings and their unit medical director and started having the goals of care conversations and introducing hospice for the patients that were clearly at end of life. And hospice, transitioning to hospice care was the right thing to do for the patient, for the family, for the staff. The support you get on hospice at end of life is extraordinary, and even after death for the family. So being able to transition a couple of patients to hospice care made a huge difference. We're actually studying it. They're doing some studies on stress levels before and after we've started doing this. So it's just another suggestion I have.
And I think it's another example of the need for authentic relationships that are supportive. That can be the chaplain, it can be people in administration. There are a couple of questions about, why do we have so many recent graduates being pushed out onto the floors? That is emblematic of the loss of available authentic relationships with people with more experience. It's because of burnout in part. It's because there are other things you can do with years of nursing experience. The biggest problem I worry about is the loss of nursing faculty to train new nurses. That's the challenge in rural areas where I spend a lot of my time. That's the biggest worry because, and interestingly, it's because someone working as a med-surg nurse can earn twice as much as somebody working as a nursing professor in a nursing school, and we need to do something about that. We need to enable working nurses, med-surg, ICU, OR, to also be teachers. And that's something that New York State, in fact, is working on as part of this year's budget.
Other thoughts on David's point about needs for more nursing faculty? All right, if not, let's go on.
Yeah,
So
I would say, sorry, really quickly, the pipeline for nursing is of critical importance. And I think in the past 10 to 20 years, it's gotten a little bit more attention than the retention conversation within hospitals. As these new grads come in, the people that are training these new grad nurses in the departments is not nursing faculty, it's your experienced nurses within the department. So as we see this increased turnover, we might be pumping out more new grad nurses, and we do need new nurses all the time. If we don't put a concurrent significant emphasis on our retention strategies, we don't have anyone to train these nurses at all once they get to the hospital. And then we're going to see kind of a cascade of quality issues, performance issues, and then more moral injury, because as part of that Hamrick model, we know that if nurses don't have the knowledge and skills that they need to keep patients safe, that puts them in very damaging situations. And we will continue to see that number's already going up, that turnover within the first 12 to 24 months as a registered nurse.
So two related questions. Should the administrative managerial cadre...
Bob, Rosanne wanted to add something?
Well, I didn't want to lose, David, your point about the new grads and what support they have. And then we kind of transitioned to faculty, but I wanted to go back to that just for a minute. And Danisha, you touched on it a bit as well. It is something I worry about too. And I'm not necessarily saying I have a suggestion. I've hired just this year at just my campus, 371 new RNs, and probably 500 last year. So it's, and some of it is from turnover, and there's more turnover just like everywhere else. And plus we've added positions because of staffing being an important issue. So we've added positions as well. And I worry about them. And I remember I talked to a nurse manager not that long ago who said, I'm on my third level preceptors at this point, because, the best ones and then the second best ones, they're already taken. And now I'm at my next level. So it's not to say, and then I was rounding and I met a nurse who was about a year in. I said, oh, I bet you're a preceptor already, because they all need so much help. And many of the students coming out have not had a lot of clinical experience. It's been a lot of simulated experience because of COVID in the hospitals and restricted access. So the needs are definitely higher, and the resources to help them are stretched. So I worry about the new nurses, and I worry about the more senior nurses who are helping them. We've had one preceptor for two, things of that nature. But I think getting back to the new grads themselves, frequent check-ins, residency programs, they need social attention at the unit level as well, because it's not just the one-on-one check-in with the leader. And if you have 70 direct reports, as somebody mentioned, that's hard to do. But the socialization and the team aspect, that's what keeps people going. So attention to the socialization, and that's at the local level usually. But I also like to have check-ins 90 days, 180 days with groups of new people just to see me and check in. Anybody else has ideas?
To Danisha's point a moment ago about the senior nurses who are really doing the training, they need to be recognized for that. On the physician side, lots of doctors who never go near a classroom, who are practicing physicians, have appointments as clinical assistant professors. And nurses should get the same recognition because they deserve it. They are teaching. And it's another instance where physicians are treated different from nurses, whether they are RN nurses or DPNs. The nurse practitioners in my hospitals are just remarkable human beings. And all of those people need that recognition that they are teachers. I think that will satisfy some of the demands for recognition that money can't address.
I'm just going to add that, yes, absolutely. And I think all of the asks that we have on these senior nurses to precept is just adding to burnout. And that we talk to, our senior nurses, and how do we incentivize nurses that are really doing much more than taking care of their patients as they're taking on the additional stress to help to precept. And it's just, sometimes it's constant coming in, the preceptors, and it does add to burnout. And how, as an organization, do we support the resources with the education department and getting that education department out on the floors and supporting staff and creating those environments? And I think also the other thing that you need, Danisha, you talked about, leadership and having 70 direct reports. How do we create structures that you have enough leaders? One of the things, we use our assistant managers, where we can help to coach and mentor new leaders into positions before they're ready to become a full nurse leader. And so whether it's unit leaders or charge nurse structures, building structures that we can coach and develop leaders safely, and they develop the confidence, but also having that resource to support that workforce adequately.
Hey,
comments,
Bob,
other thoughts on this?
can I ask a question? Because this is something that I've
Yes.
been curious about, and this is the place to get an answer that I think will be valuable to everyone. I'm curious to know what the three of you think has been the impact of the really dramatic growth in the number of doctors of nursing practice, the advanced nurse practitioners on RNs, on floor nurses, ICU, OR nurses. Has it been a positive influence?
I'll start. I'm a DNP. My DNP is not a clinical DNP. It's in nursing leadership. That's my practice area. Now, I was a critical care nurse, and I still belong to AACN. It's the best professional nursing organization. I'm not sure if it is affecting practice at the bedside directly that a staff nurse would feel. It's such a good question. It's definitely affected my practice. There's no doubt about it. I think deeper. I do deeper. I've learned different ways of doing things. And for my practice, it's made a difference. I've seen clinical NPs that get their doctorates, and they're engaged with really improving care in different ways that they hadn't been before. So I'm definitely seeing a difference in practice, no doubt about it. The question of how it is affecting the direct care nurse, I'm not sure. All of that ends up affecting the direct care nurse, but it's secondary, not primary, if that makes any sense. And the other speakers may disagree with me.
I guess, you could take it from a lot of different directions. I think having APPs and particularly nurse practitioners as part of our support team has certainly helped the team with an added level of support for care, someone to communicate and work with us. We have several groups of nurse practitioners that work in the hospital and in our ambulatory practices. I think one of the biggest things when I talk about this group is it's a lot of my nurses are in school. We support that. We provide them with tuition. What I'm trying to work on is structures that I can keep them in my organization. We have this great talent going to school, and I do not want to lose them. So how do we make sure that I'm keeping them here and supporting them? And that's what I've challenged a lot of our different practice environments. If you're going to use APPs, please let's set up an internship program that we can develop our own nurses into these practices.
Yeah, I think the growth of advanced practice providers has just tremendously beneficial to our patients and our communities. The literature is saturated in showing that. We do see an increase in folks wanting to obtain education because of the challenges being a bedside registered nurse, and they're looking at that as an opportunity to get away from a career that's increasingly becoming one that you can't stay in your entire life. It's physically and emotionally impossible. So I think that really looking at valued clinical ladders at the bedside so that nurses are engaged and rewarded for staying and growing and becoming clinical experts and helping to guide our profession forward is really important. We want all nurses to pursue advanced education because we know we need advanced practice nurses in order to help take care of our community. At the same time, we need advanced clinicians at the bedside in the bedside registered nurse role. And this isn't just at the bedside, this is in school nursing, out in the community, in public health. So we do need to invest in, like we talked about before, those retention strategies, and those have some very strong economic ties associated with them.
Thank you.
I agree, Danisha, that is so important. I just had a meeting this week on how do we incentivize that education and those clinical ladders and certifications at the bedside. So critical from what nurses are being asked to do at the bedside, and how can we incentivize them and reward them for the hard work that they put into their profession.
Yeah, you reminded me of something else there. The acuity of the patients is just increasing exponentially. And with the amount of our population suffering from long COVID and the increase in comorbidities, we know that our communities and our patients are sicker. Additionally, healthcare is becoming increasingly specialized, right? Our nurses, if you're in a cardiovascular intensive care unit versus a transplant unit versus a trauma unit, you need to invest many, many years in developing a significant level of expertise in those areas. It's no longer, and I won't say it ever was, a nurse is a nurse is a nurse, and you can just shuffle them around everywhere and they'll do the same thing. We need people to be there. We need to invest in them growing this clinical expertise that really is so incredibly valuable for the quality of care that we're able to provide. And then arming nurses with that knowledge and ability to do their jobs in these high acuity situations helps to address one of those clinical buckets of moral distress.
So just want to remind our audience to, again, feel free to ask questions. We have some time remaining. Here is a question that two questioners raised about whether administrators need or should be required to have clinical experience. Any thoughts on that? One person wrote, remote environment of key leaders created a greater gap between the boardroom and the bedside. And virtual meetings are full of blank screens. How do we get that back?
Well, we're not going to get rid of virtual, so we go back to in-person. But the other question was whether you should have clinical experience or not. And I've seen administrators with clinical experience who are fabulous. I've seen administrators with clinical experience who aren't. And I've seen administrators without clinical experience who are fabulous. So I've seen the gamut. And I think clinical helps and I could see the difference as the chief nurse, like trying to explain something to somebody who doesn't understand clinical takes a lot more work, and you have to take them on rounds to show them what it means and talk to nurses. So it takes a little more work than somebody who has been clinical for sure, but the right person whose heart is in the right place and mind is in the right place, you can train them.
And I think it depends on what role they're in. And if you're responsible for clinical operations, it really helps to have a clinical background to understand. But there's all levels of clinical background. You know, having 2 years of clinical practice versus 10 years, is that going to make a difference? I think we have to also recognize that we need to support leaders. We need to educate leaders. We need to coach. We have to have mentors for leaders. It's not just that, you know, back in my day, years ago, it was always the best clinical person was tapped on the shoulder to become the nurse manager, but wasn't always the best leader. And you know, you have to want and desire to be a leader, but you need to have the organizational support and coaching and mentoring to become a really good leader.
Yeah, I don't think you need to have a license and years of experience in a particular healthcare provider profession, but I think every administrator in every hospital should be given an opportunity to volunteer in their emergency department and spend some time doing the most rudimentary things, because just having a comfort level with being present at a code or when a history and physical is being taken, or watching people do their jobs, not just doing rounds, which is important. Administrative rounds are very valuable, but to be in the emergency department or in the ICU as the extra set of hands with proper safety training for 6 or 8 hours, that makes anyone a better administrator. And I tell all my students in the bioethics program, any chance they have to get some hands-on experience, whether it's volunteering with the New York State Surrogate Decision-Making Committee or volunteering with an ambulance service or really anything, that makes you a better leader.
So here's a question. I'm just curious of what the current registered nurse turnover rates are at the hospitals the speakers are representing. So at this stage of COVID, is it calming down? We heard a lot about nurses leaving 2 months ago, a year ago. As the prevalence of ICU patients with COVID may be decreasing a bit from the surge? I mean, are we seeing any change in turnover, or have things stabilized? What's going on? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's not going to calm down. I think it's just opened the door to a lot of challenges that nurses are facing. Our turnover right now is 14.2%. It's the highest that we've seen in years. I'm not comfortable when it's above 10%. We've seen that inch up. A lot of turnover that we're seeing is nurses are going to become travelers. They're getting married in a year. I want to make some money. It's difficult with all of these surges to get my PTO. So if I work as a traveler, I could work for 3 months and take a month off. Travelers are causing a gap in a lot of organizations. And I don't see that is going to end, because they've created a niche and a market for themselves. And I also think work-life balance, as the new generation is coming in, they're just looking for a much more healthier work-life balance. And COVID didn't help us to be able to give that to them. And we've got to figure out how to make sure that we're supporting nurses. So we're seeing nurses leave for ambulatory practices where they don't have to work on weekends. Some nurses are opting out of 10-hour shifts, the 12-hour shifts, something I never thought I would see, but they really want to have a Monday through Friday job. And that's where most of my turnover is. So again, back to that incentive, the other, looking at certifications and education, I think we have to incentivize people to work nights and weekends. It's really hard, and it's really a challenge to give up important moments in your life for your career, and that's what we've always been expected to do in nursing.
Here's a question. We've discussed legal compliance, chaplaincy support for nurses. Are there ways that clinical ethics consultation services, clinical ethicists, can alleviate nurses' moral distress during or in addition to ethics consults?
Absolutely. We have our nurses are very comfortable calling ethics consults and are allowed to do so. It doesn't have to go through a physician or anybody else. So, and it's extremely helpful. I actually had to be on a call one Friday evening. It was like from 5 p to 6 p because a nurse had called an ethics consult on a discharge. She did not feel it was a safe discharge. The physician felt it was a safe discharge. There was a total disagreement about that. And I had to talk it through with our ethicist, the nurse manager, the nurse, the case manager, the social worker. Everybody was involved to reach that decision, and having the ethics perspective really helped a lot.
Great. Other comments on that?
Yeah, that's so important. And it sounds like your institution operationalizes this really well. One thing we don't want to do with ethics consults is have that be a morally distressing situation in and of itself. And some systems, their process for ethics consults might be a lot of steps before you put in the ethics consults. And I always say the only response to anyone putting in an ethics consult is thank you so much for taking the time to put in this ethics consult. We want to make sure that there's no air of punitive response when someone puts in an ethics consult. We shouldn't have to call the house supervisor and then call the nurse manager and go up a million chains, because we know that staunch hierarchy is also a contributor in morally distressing circumstances. If we have a system where we can say, something's not sitting right with me, I don't even really know how to put it into words right now, I know who I can call. I can call an ethics consult and they can help me sort this out. That is so incredibly valuable.
Great. Here's a question. How does nursing leadership intend to mend the rift created during the pandemic when many upper-level administrators stayed home and unit-level managers did not enter patient rooms?
No, I'm not sure what to say about that. We made sure in our organization, I was here 7 days a week. My team was here 7 days a week with me. I didn't even ask them to come in. They were here with me. We were visible. We didn't know what we were doing. If we didn't know what we're doing, how are we supposed to, do this? We had to have a presence. We had to know what was going on every minute. And the leaders did go into patients' rooms. The nurse managers were there. We met regularly to understand what is happening and what is going on in those units. If you need to have that support and that frontline visibility and communication.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that either, Leanne. That's a big rift, and I don't know. I mean, it almost feels like it should be like apology and forgiveness in a way, to maybe get to a place where you could move forward and get over it. I don't know, but this is not my area of expertise at all, honestly.
So we have, I think, maybe time for one or two more questions. Then we'll just see if the panelists have any final thoughts or want to add anything to what has already been said. Just to come back to futility, because there are a couple of questions about it. What do we do when it comes to end-of-life cases in the ICU and hem-onc? These cases are unavoidable and cause moral distress. How do we help nurses through these cases?
Ethics consultation. And
Okay.
mediation. So many of those complicated medical refusal of treatment, insistence on medically unnecessary treatment situations could be resolved to everyone's benefit if there were just someone who was skilled in bioethics mediation who could intervene and, for example, present the perspective of the floor nurse or the ICU nurse and the difficulty of certain kinds of demands that family members sometimes put on the nursing staff. That's where bioethics is at its best.
Yeah, I agree. Ethics, and also there's another comment somewhere mentioning the chaplains again, which we talked about, and also social workers. They're really skilled in helping with this too. So hopefully all those resources are available.
And I think advocacy, identifying issues and making sure that we can get out and have family meetings, and that we have people that are whoever it is in your organization that can help to manage that, whether it's your associate medical directors or other leaders. We shouldn't leave this to our staff nurses, our frontline nurses, our care managers. Even when, my patient advocate, she needs to know when she gets in trouble and how can she get the team together to have these family meetings.
All right, here's a question. How do those in this group feel that magnet status provides protection for supporting a healthy work environment or not?
I mean, I'll take it because I'm new to the magnet world, honestly. I was able to lead with all the clinical nurses, really, Weill Cornell to its first designation about 3 years ago. And it's really a game changer if you're doing it in the real way. I mean, the magnet domains of structural empowerment and transformational leadership, if you're not making up answers that are just not real, if you're really living it in the way that it's intended, it's a game changer for the culture in the organization. I totally believe in it, honestly.
Absolutely. And if you're not doing it for the right reasons, it's only harder. We just received our third designation last year, and it has just helped me to be able to really develop this culture and within the organization. The most benefit that I receive is the resources that I'm allowed to, because the nurses being empowered, having a voice, really understanding their professional practice model and helping us to reach our goals is recognized by our board of director and our senior leaders, and they will never want to not give that support to their frontline nurses to maintain that magnet designation. And they're really willing to, when I talk about asking for incentivizing for clinical ladders or other programs, that goes under that umbrella of how we support nurses, and they're very happy to support that.
I wonder if one of you might want to just clarify for those in the audience who may not know what magnet status is, because we may have students who are not sure.
Sure. So the ANCC created the Magnet Recognition Program. It was first created to look during a nursing shortage in the 80s and how some organizations were able to attract and retain their nurses in their organization. So they set out to look at a particular group of organizations, very diverse across the United States, community, hospital, large organizations, and to see if there were certain elements in these organizations that were key to keeping nurses. And that was its inception. And lo and behold, they did find that there were certain structures in these organizations. Nurses had a voice. They had transformational leadership. They had great collaborative relationships. They had great relationships with their physicians, on. And it has grown and developed. It basically supports nurses, recognizes nurses. The shared decision-making structure is just an absolute framework that needs to be demonstrated in your documents and on-site visit. And each designation, they're coming and looking to see that you have continued to grow as an organization and supporting it. It has now become very outcome-based. So, early years, you could write a lot of fluffy stories of how nurses worked within an organization. Today, to receive this designation, you have to demonstrate a lot of empirical outcomes that really prove that you have advanced patient outcomes and supportive nursing environments.
Great, thank you. So we just have 1 or 2 minutes left. I wondered if any of the panelists want to have any concluding comments or thoughts or things that weren't asked that might be important to say.
Well, I'll just end with I have hope. I think we're going to come out of this stronger, and it's going to be a rocky road to get there. But I absolutely have hope. Nurses are phenomenal, and this is our time, really. So, and we need leaders. And I'm kind of distressed by some of the comments about not having supportive leaders. And that will not work. So that I have to say that worries me very, very much. So I'm going to campaign for authentic relational leadership to be a big part of this solution and the leadership development to get us there.
That's great.
I agree. I also have hope, and we are so critical to the future of healthcare, and we have to figure out how to support nurses and how to move forward. And we've got a lot of attention coming out of this awful crisis, and we really need to understand what the problems are and put real solutions in place. Recognize that value what nurses are asked to do, their commitment, their dedication, and salaries and nursing staffing have to be baked into that.
Amen. David,
I heard
go, Danisha.
I heard a quote recently that hope is a tactical necessity, and I've been saying that pretty much everywhere. But I'll just end by saying a tremendous thank you to all of my fellow nurses and leaders. The work that this community does every single day, I'm so honored to be a part of, and some of the most brilliant, caring people I have ever met are amongst the nursing profession. And I know that when we come together, we can do hard things. We have done hard things before, and we will do hard things again. So just thank you to the nurses putting in their literal blood, sweat, and tears every day.
Hear, hear.
And
David?
I would just say it is a pleasure to have been on this panel. It is an honor for me to work with nurses every day. And every nurse should ask some leadership figure in their hospital to be an advocate. Because if you don't ask, you don't get.
Great. Well, thank you, all of the panelists. It was an amazing conversation, I think really inspiring, and I think full of hope and wise. To all of you who tuned in and joined us, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Just to say that if you like this, we have other events on our website, past events, our prior event on moral distress among nurses you might find of interest, as well as information about our courses and other free information and things you might find of interest. So thank you all so much for joining us. Upwards and onwards, and wishing you all the best, and be well. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye-bye.